My father-in-law set down his wine glass at his own 70th birthday dinner, looked directly at me across the table, and delivered the line he'd apparently been rehearsing all evening. "This family doesn't do charity cases. I hope you understand that, whatever happens with you and my son." 12 people went quiet. My husband's jaw tightened beside me, and I simply nodded, because I knew something my father-in-law didn't, something his own accountant, sitting 3 seats down, was about to confirm in a way that would make that entire sentence collapse in front of the whole table. If you've ever been called a burden by someone who never actually checked the math, stay with me, because what happened in the next 4 minutes at that dinner table changed the way an entire family understood who was actually holding things together. My name is Sarah, and for 6 years, my father-in-law Gerald had operated under a very specific, very confident assumption about who I was in his son's life. Gerald built a successful regional trucking company over 4 decades, the kind of self-made success story he referenced constantly, usually as a preamble to some lesson about hard work and self-sufficiency that he seemed to believe the younger generation, broadly, had failed to internalize. He was proud, direct, and had a specific, rigid framework for evaluating people's worth, based almost entirely on visible financial contribution and traditional markers of career success. I met his son, David, 7 years before the dinner I'm about to describe, during a period of my life that Gerald, once he learned about it, never quite let go of. I had recently left a demanding but ultimately unsustainable corporate marketing job, dealing with burnout serious enough that I'd needed several months of genuine rest before I could function normally again. During that transitional period, David and I fell in love, and by the time we married a year later, I was still rebuilding my career slowly, working part-time as a freelance consultant while I figured out my next steps. Gerald, from nearly the very beginning of our relationship, developed a narrative about me that calcified quickly and never fully softened. I was the woman who'd needed saving, financially and otherwise, by his son, a framing that ignored almost entirely the actual trajectory of what happened in the years that followed, in favor of a snapshot of me at my most vulnerable moment, one he apparently decided represented my permanent condition. I want to walk through what actually happened in the 6 years following that difficult transitional period, because the gap between Gerald's frozen impression and reality is the entire foundation of this story. Within 18 months of our wedding, my freelance consulting work had grown into something considerably more substantial than the modest side income Gerald assumed it remained. I specialized in marketing strategy for mid-sized manufacturing companies, a niche I'd stumbled into somewhat by accident but had developed genuine expertise in, eventually building a client roster that included several companies considerably larger than the modest local businesses Gerald imagined when he pictured my work at all by year 3 of our marriage. I'd formalized my consulting practice into an actual company, hired 2 part-time contractors to help manage growing client demand, and was generating an income that, by year 5, meaningfully exceeded David's own salary as a mechanical engineer, a fact that Gerald, as far as I could tell, never fully absorbed, despite David mentioning it to him on more than one occasion. I don't think Gerald was being deliberately obtuse about this information, so much as genuinely uninterested in updating a story he found emotionally satisfying. Gerald liked believing his son had rescued a struggling woman from financial precarity. It fit his broader worldview about self-sufficiency and traditional family roles, and I think, on some level, actively updating that narrative would have required him to reconsider assumptions he'd held for decades about how these kinds of stories were supposed to unfold. About 3 months before Gerald's 70th birthday dinner, David had come to me with a difficult conversation he needed to have with his father, a conversation about David's own career. David had been quietly unhappy in his engineering role for over a year and had been developing, alongside his actual job, plans to start a small specialized manufacturing consulting business of his own, drawing on his engineering background combined with insights from my marketing work. The plan was solid, genuinely well-researched, and David had been building toward it carefully for months, including saving a meaningful cushion before making any transition. When David mentioned this plan to his father, Gerald's reaction had been swift and dismissive, framed almost entirely around a specific worry, that David was making an unstable decision under the influence of a wife whose own financial history, in Gerald's telling, suggested a pattern of instability that David was apparently at risk of absorbing. "You need to be the stable one in that marriage," Gerald had told David, according to what David relayed to me afterward, clearly still upset by the conversation. "I love Sarah, but let's be honest about where she was when you two got together. I don't want to watch you make reckless decisions because you've convinced yourself her situation has somehow changed." This conversation, more than anything else, set the stage for what happened at that birthday dinner 3 months later. I need to introduce a specific character here who becomes central to everything that follows. Gerald's longtime accountant, a meticulous, soft-spoken man named Frank Delgado, who had managed Gerald's trucking company's finances for nearly 15 years and had, over that time, developed a reputation within the family for scrupulous, almost obsessive accuracy in anything related to money. Frank, it turned out, had a connection to my professional life that neither Gerald nor I had fully appreciated until that dinner. About a year earlier, Frank's own trucking company client base had led him to a referral for accounting services with one of my consulting clients, a mid-sized manufacturing company that, coincidentally, I'd been working with for over 2 years by that point. Frank had encountered my name directly through this connection, reviewing invoices and financial documentation for a company that listed my consulting firm as a significant line item vendor. He'd recognized my name immediately, given the family connection, and had quietly developed a fairly accurate picture of my actual professional and financial standing, a picture considerably more current and accurate than anything Gerald possessed. Frank had never directly discussed this with Gerald before that birthday dinner, largely out of simple professional discretion, not feeling it was his place to volunteer information about a family member's private business affairs. But Frank was attending that dinner as a longtime family friend as much as Gerald's accountant, and he was seated close enough to hear exactly what Gerald said when the conversation turned toward me. Gerald's 70th birthday dinner was held at a private room in an upscale steakhouse, gathering close family and a handful of longtime friends, including Frank, for what was meant to be a warm, celebratory evening honoring Gerald's milestone birthday. The conversation, about an hour into dinner, turned toward David's recent decision, made, in the end, despite his father's objections, to formally launch his consulting business, having given notice at his engineering job the previous week. Gerald, several glasses of wine into the evening, raised the subject directly, his tone carrying the specific, performative concern of someone building toward a larger point. "I still think this is a mistake," Gerald said, addressing David, but clearly speaking for the benefit of the table. "You've got a family to think about now, a stable job, and instead you're jumping into something risky, right when you should be focused on being the reliable one." He paused, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that preceded, almost always, some version of the comment I'd absorbed variations of for years. "I love you, Sarah," Gerald continued, turning toward me directly. "But I think you understand what I'm getting at. This family doesn't do charity cases. I hope you understand that. Whatever happens with you and my son, David needs to be the stable one. Because frankly, I'm not sure the finances in your household can absorb this kind of risk otherwise." I want to describe what happened in the several seconds immediately following this comment, because the room's reaction mattered considerably to what came next. David's jaw had visibly tightened beside me, and I could see him gathering himself to respond, clearly prepared to defend both his own decision and me directly. But before he could speak, Frank, sitting 3 seats down the table, set down his fork with a specific, deliberate precision. "Gerald," Frank said, his voice carrying the particular calm authority of a man who has decided something needs correcting and has no intention of letting the moment pass. "I need to say something, and I think it's actually relevant to this conversation." Gerald, mildly surprised by the interjection, gestured for Frank to continue, clearly expecting some kind of supportive elaboration on his own point. "I don't think you have an accurate picture of Sarah's financial situation," Frank said, "and honestly, I think that's relevant to what you just said about charity cases and household stability." I want to walk through exactly what Frank said next, because it's the moment this entire story pivots around. "About a year ago," Frank continued, "I did some accounting work connected to Meridian Fabrication, one of the manufacturing companies here in the region. Sarah's consulting firm is one of their largest vendors for strategic marketing work. I've seen the invoices directly. Her firm bills that single client alone somewhere in the range of $200,000 annually, and from what I understand, Meridian isn't even her largest account. The table had gone very quiet. Gerald's expression shifted into visible confusion, clearly processing information that directly contradicted the frozen picture he'd carried for years. I don't know Sarah's full financial picture, Frank continued, and it's not really my place to speculate beyond what I've directly seen. But based on what I have seen, I don't think Charity Case is anywhere close to an accurate description. If anything, from what I've observed, Sarah's business likely generates more revenue than David's engineering salary did, which might actually explain why David feels confident enough to take this risk with his own career right now, because his household isn't only depending on one income the way you seem to be assuming. I want to describe Gerald's expression during this correction, because it's a specific, complicated sequence that I've thought about often since. It wasn't immediate anger, though some of that eventually surfaced. It was, first, a kind of genuine, visible confusion, the specific expression of a man confronting information that doesn't fit a story he's told himself confidently, for years, without ever bothering to verify it. "That can't be right," Gerald said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confident authority. "Sarah's always just done some small consulting thing on the side, hasn't she?" "Dad," David said, finally finding his voice, "I've told you multiple times over the past few years that Sarah's business has grown considerably. I don't think you've ever really listened when I've mentioned it." I want to be honest about what I felt, sitting at that table, watching this exchange unfold. I didn't feel triumphant, exactly. The moment carried too much genuine hurt, accumulated over 6 years, for pure vindication to be the primary emotion. But I did feel something like relief, the specific relief of finally having an inaccurate, diminishing story about my life corrected in front of the exact audience who'd believed it longest. I decided in that moment that I wasn't going to let Frank's correction be the only voice speaking to the actual truth of my situation. "Frank's right," I said, addressing Gerald directly. "My consulting firm generated just over $400,000 in revenue last year. I have 2 full-time contractors working under me now, and I've been the primary earner in our household for the past 2 years. David's decision to leave his engineering job wasn't reckless. It was actually a financially sound decision, made specifically because our household has the stability to absorb this transition, a stability that exists in significant part because of the business I built during exactly the period you've apparently decided still defines who I am." Gerald was quiet for a long moment, clearly working through the full weight of what had just been revealed. "I had no idea," he finally said. "I think I've been carrying around an old picture of you this whole time, and I never really checked whether it was still accurate." "You didn't," I said, not unkindly, but honestly. "For 6 years, actually, I think it was just easier to keep believing the version of me that fit your worldview, rather than actually updating it based on anything David told you." The remainder of that birthday dinner proceeded considerably differently than its first hour had suggested it would. Several other family members, having witnessed this exchange, began asking genuine, curious questions about my business, questions considerably more substantive than anything I'd been asked at a family gathering in years. Gerald, notably, went quiet for much of the remaining meal, visibly processing the gap between his confident assumption and the reality Frank had just revealed. Near the end of the dinner, as guests began saying their goodbyes, he approached me privately. "I owe you an apology," he said, "and I want to be fair in noting that this admission seemed to cost him something genuine, given his usual confident, unyielding manner. I think I've held on to an old story about you because it was convenient, not because I ever actually checked whether it was still true. That's not fair to you, and I think it's probably shaped how I've treated you for years without me fully realizing it." "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "I think the harder thing, going forward, is actually updating the story, not just acknowledging it was wrong tonight." The months following that birthday dinner brought a gradual, genuine shift in how Gerald engaged with me. He began asking real questions about my business at family gatherings, questions that reflected actual curiosity rather than the polite, distracted courtesy he'd extended for years. He also, notably, stopped making the specific comments about stability and risk that had characterized so much of his engagement with David's career decision, apparently recognizing, after that dinner, that his entire framework for evaluating our household's financial situation had been built on information that was years out of date. David's consulting business, for what it's worth, has done well in the time since. Not without challenges, the ordinary difficulties of building something new, but genuinely well, buoyed in part by connections and strategic insight I've been able to offer from my own years of building a similar kind of business. Frank and I never discussed that dinner directly afterward, but I did thank him, briefly, at a family gathering some months later. His response has stayed with me. "I just corrected something inaccurate," he said. "You'd built enough of the truth yourself, over enough years, that it wasn't hard to see clearly once I actually looked. I just don't understand why nobody else had bothered to look sooner." I think about that dinner often, and about the specific, uncomfortable gap it revealed between a confident, long-held assumption and a reality that had actually changed considerably, right in front of someone who simply never bothered to update his picture. I don't think Gerald is a fundamentally cruel man. I think, like a lot of people, he found a specific story about me emotionally satisfying, a story that confirmed his broader worldview about self-sufficiency and traditional family dynamics, and he held on to that story for years, well past the point where it stopped being accurate, because updating it would have required him to reconsider assumptions he'd built an entire identity around. What I want you to take from this, if you take anything at all, is that the people who confidently measure your worth based on an old snapshot of your life are often the people who've put the least effort into actually checking whether that snapshot is still accurate. Their certainty about your limitations usually says considerably more about their own resistance to updating a comfortable story than it does about who you've actually become. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been measured by an old, outdated version of your life, by someone who never bothered to check whether it was still true, I want you to remember something. The people who hold on to an outdated story about you usually do it because it's convenient, not because they've actually looked closely. Your actual worth doesn't require their permission or their updated understanding to be real, but it's still deeply satisfying when the truth finally catches up to their careless assumption. If this story hit home, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, has anyone in your life ever confidently misjudged you based on who you used to be, rather than who you'd actually become? I read every single comment, and I've got more stories like this one coming every week.